Okay, so that was an amazing panel. I feel very privileged to be able to be a moderator for that. I would like to start by tying a couple of threads together and maybe get you guys to comment on and pull on some of those threads a little further. One of the things I thought that was really interesting about this panel was the way in which questions of loss and remediation of loss were addressed in such different ways, and yet ways which resonated off one another in very poetic and sometimes philosophical and theoretical ways as well. So I'm thinking about loss and remediation of loss through various practices. If we talk about loss of homes, homes to which we can never return, loss of our connection to nature, and our way of knowing and understanding nature, whether it's the night sky or how to survive in the mountains, loss of traditional knowledges and embodied knowledge practices that maybe ancestors once knew that we no longer know, and loss of a sense of our connection to others. There was a whole lot of interesting themes about othering, being othered, the other being othered by the others, aliens, alienation, estrangement. And I'm thinking, how can we talk about these sort of intertwined issues? And my special request is, because I'd like this to be more of a dialogue rather than just kind of continuing, maybe you can talk to each other about your work and how your work connects in interesting ways, and that can start off what will hopefully be interesting audience questions as well. Anybody want to start?
About this lost civilization.
Yeah.
It's actually it's one of my many works. I'm always interested in what people don't believe in now, but actually, if you go back before the modern time, we actually lost a lot of the knowledge. Yeah, and then when I investigate into that type of knowledge, then everything connect to each other. Yes, so that's my practice about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure about the notion of loss as such, but maybe more the idea of sort of like healing, maybe, or like
Remediation, right?
Remediation, yeah, through a certain reconnection with maybe like what I would be interested in is more like a kind of knowledge, let's say, that has been historically associated to female knowledge, or like knowledge that was more like a in the hands of women who were closer to maybe like agriculture or farming or some kind of a this kind of a practice that did not sort of like detach them from their land, basically, and this kind of knowledge that had been somehow eradicated, or so loss, but at the same time perhaps the idea is not to sort of like regret or cry upon this loss, but more use it in a different way, or something around these lines, maybe.
Seek modes of recovery or recuperation. Yeah.
I'm not sure I'd say that my work has a particular focus on loss. It's more of change and moving up the gradient of how things get really weird.
In your work, the way I found that there was an interesting sense, you focus less on loss than on the sort of remediation part. It's perhaps if we've lost our connection to, say, the sky because of our technology and the way that we live in urban surroundings, your answer to that was imagination, to as a remedial strategy for returning ourselves to some other part of our nature. perhaps.
create
Yeah?
your own constellation, essentially.
The letter to my sister, or from my sister, Sarah, I think her, in terms of what she was trying to say, I think it was a cry, but I think it was also a call to action, perhaps a call to action if only to shed light on movement that has really slowed down, which is an anti-war movement, I think, in the country that perhaps should actually be placed into more focus, and so it really speaks to issues around terror, but also and the loss that's inherent in terror, and but then also a call around a war that is just the war on terror, which is just as terrorizing and terrifying as yeah. So
I wanted to just bring up something less thematic, but more along the lines of your process. I was really interested in reading about how you work, and you're working with an outside director, and I thought maybe it'd be really informative to hear about that dialogue that exists between the two of you and how it manifests itself in this really poetic and beautiful performance that we saw.
Yeah, I had the really wonderful opportunity to work with a dear friend of mine and also a collaborator. I've worked with her only once in the past, but I really admire her work, Clea Miniker, who's a theater director, but also a puppeteer and a designer of light and shadow. I've always used light and shadow in my own work, and I also use a lot of material in my own practice and in the studio, and I've always described what I did in the studio as pushing material around, or pushing paper around, really. And I was curious. I mean, people have always been curious about what more I do, and I try to explain that, and that doesn't ever give enough information to people. And I thought, what would it feel like to have somebody or have a live feed camera hover above me, or perhaps below a table? What would that look like? What kinds of in terms of what kinds of imagery does it call but also what am I thinking about? And that letter is something that I think about, and the material within that letter that was given to me was something I think about a lot. But the translation is also something I often do, and the two play with one another. Sometimes they come together, sometimes they don't, and that's okay.
When you guys were watching each other's talks, what did it bring out for you? Because for me, there were so many similar visceral experiences and then aesthetics that kind of intertwined. So I was just curious, how did it feel to be paired with one another in this section?
I thought it was an honor. I mean, just to have done that, but then also to have received so much from Bruce. It was really wonderful just to get a sense of what that his relationship to geographies, but also cosmologies, is something that I think about in my practice quite a bit, and to get that aerial perspective, but from a much more from a much more grounded way of thinking and maneuvering our day-to-day existence in our densely populated, highly urbanized society. So it was really wonderful, and then of course to receive so much between Marwa and Chen. So.
I have to be very honest. I was the last one, so I was very nervous down there, but I didn't really hear a lot, but I saw a lot of the image, and I was out to 3 of you, and then this, especially you and his connections were like, whoa, and then also the forest, the snow forest. So that's how I prepared. Well, what I saw. I just have to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty nervous coming up after that performance. But I guess I'm still processing. But it's opened up correspondences and connections that I haven't really thought of. So I guess I'll spend some time unpacking that later.
Go for it.
So, first of all, I'm incredibly shocked myself about how that whole thing came together, because, I don't necessarily spend time in controlling that much, where I've looked at every single presentation and every single, no, it's really, again, it's within the conversations we've had. Multiple Skype meetings and exchanges by email, and even the way that this sort of happens is almost like an astral planes kind of way of curating. And but I was, of course, very much aware of the fact that all 4 of you have very strong research-based practices, and that there is that aspect of quite a lot of content, but at the same time, I was very intrigued about the formal relationships. That the fact that there is a very strong formal aspect to the practice, that it somehow the research begins to translate itself into these beautiful images, which is why we have to call them art, because at the end of the day, we're talking about visual art. So I guess what I wanted to hear a little bit about was this, the relationship between the research and the translation of it into objects or formal images, images that are in a way also free of the research. It's very, I think it's incredibly magical that you could actually do that, because I almost feel like I could have no understanding of what you were researching, but still connect to what you were doing just through the image. And I think that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind in terms of the practicing artists these days, and why I feel like a forum like this is important, because we can't hardly ever really unpack what an artist is doing through just their images. So if you can just share a little bit about that translation of the research into the image, that would be great.
Well, I guess that in my case, it's still, yeah, I mean, this process, or like this research process, is still really at the beginning, actually. And this is a project I started, or a research I started less than a year ago, and it came out of a feminist reading group that I was running in Beirut, and where we had invited several ecofeminist groups and the autonomous women's movement from Kurdistan and other feminist groups to join the reading group and share their writings. And with the autonomous women's movement, we had read the text written by a guerrilla woman in one of her diaries. So she had, I mean, we translated it into English and had read it, basically. And the two women came and participated in the reading group. So this is how this whole thing started, and a lot of work that I do start in this, let's say, collective way of researching. So research, or the idea of doing research, is always in my case, is always a collective process. And it doesn't, it's not just about me going after something. It's about conversation, actually, and many different conversations. And one of them is this conversation with the autonomous women's movement, and going back to, I paid them back the visit to Iraqi Kurdistan, and we spent a few days or week also reading and going through guerrilla diaries and texts, and having a lot of ideological conversations. So if this is this is like the research process, basically.
For me, the most dangerous part of being a research-based artist is that I don't know when to stop. And I'm a nerd. And so that's one. And I'm very into, of course, the pseudoscience that nobody would believe now. And then I enjoyed what I discovered. And then meanwhile, I still have to represent my material, but I couldn't copy it. I'm like many artists, that representation is the most difficult part. So while developing the ideas or concepts, I'm still doing research, and then slowly the shape will come out. And then that's my process.
I spent years gathering news accounts of disappearances, all kinds, whether they were mass disappearances or individual disappearances. And I came across this news account back in December of 2010, I believe it was, in which 166 Hajis, or pilgrims, that were going from Calcutta and making a supposed pilgrimage to Mecca for the Hajj, had made head count in Saudi Arabia, but upon leaving, they were nowhere to be found. So essentially all 166 of them had disappeared, at least in terms of our paperwork. And I was, it quickly came into the news, and then it also left the media quite quickly. And the story really stayed with me, and since then, a project sort of emerged out of that called Sea Change, which is a project that started soon after that. And I think we're 7 years into it now, but it's about 9 persons that go missing by sea. And each chapter reveals over the course of hundreds of works, they come in the form of notes and objects and perhaps pieces like this. But all of the fragments sort of come together, and they tell and narrate each character and each character's journey. And they are sort of revealed. It's a lifelong project, and I do a lot of research, but it fills me like a vessel, and then I have the capacity at some point in time to kind of like a sponge need to release it, and that's when I go into the studio, and that's where a lot of the more formal aspects come into play with what I've read and learned and heard, and then how it comes down.
So it looks like we have to wrap it up pretty quickly here. Before I open it up for one question from the audience, I wanted to leave with 4 sentences from the different presentations that I'm not going to attribute But they're linked together, I think, in interesting ways, just to leave you to sort of chew on the connections and questions about alienness and otherness and strangeness and belonging and our connection to home and to the earth and to the cosmos. The first sentence, looking for the alien. Second sentence, you are the barbarian. Third sentence, all creatures have a right to exist in this place. And the last one, imagine an us so large that it may as well have been somebody else. Any questions?
I think we should just wrap up on that note. It's so perfect.
We can keep talking at the break then.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much.